It was a warm, sunny afternoon, and the house was filled with a comforting energy. My name is Emily, and I'm 25 years old. I live with my dad, Michael, but my life hasn't always been this way. When I was very young, I lost my mother to a serious illness. Since then, my dad and I have only had each other. Despite the hardship, my childhood was filled with love and care. Michael did his best to fill the void left by my mother's absence, playing the role of both parents. His love for me was evident in everything he did, from comforting me during scary nights to teaching me how to ride a bike. Life continued peacefully in the familiar rhythm we had built, but all that changed the day I turned 18. I had just entered university, and that moment marked the beginning of my adult life. I still remember the rush of emotions, the excitement, the fear, and the overwhelming feeling of leaving home. It was the first time I had stepped out from the safety of my father's arms and ventured into a world that was vast, unknown, and filled with challenges. At the beginning, university life was a whirlwind of new faces, experiences, and ideas. I made friends from all over, from different walks of life. Lectures were engaging, and dorm life was filled with moments of laughter and stories from people who had traveled far from home. But there were times when I would pause and feel a deep sense of longing. I missed the comfort of my home, the security of knowing my dad was just in the next room. Every time I thought of him, a wave of homesickness would hit me. The image of my dad telling me stories about my mother on quiet evenings, his eyes sad but full of love, would fill my mind. It wasn't long before my life began to shift in ways I couldn't have imagined. One day, I found myself hanging out with a group of girls in the dormitory. They were far different from me, adventurous, confident, and outgoing. At first, I felt out of place. My world had been simple, built around the love of my dad and the dreams I had for my future. But as time passed, I found myself drawn to their lifestyle. Weekends became a blur of makeup, dresses, loud music, and the smell of alcohol. The dormitory room was always buzzing with energy as my friends prepared for their nights out. They talked about parties, boys, and life in ways that made me curious. The first time I went to a bar with them, I remember feeling a mix of excitement and uncertainty. The flashing lights, loud music, laughter, and the buzz of conversation were overwhelming. But as the night wore on, I let go of my reservations. I joined in, dancing, laughing, and learning to drink. At first, it was just a little, but soon enough, I was part of the crowd, losing myself in the freedom and energy of the night. Soon, I wasn't just an observer of the fun, I was a participant. I would return to the dormitory late at night, tipsy and full of laughter, sharing stories with my friends. I learned the bittersweet taste of wine, the thrill of dancing until dawn, and the joy of living without worrying about the consequences. In those moments, I felt more alive than I had ever felt. Then I met him, Max, a classmate who stood out from the rest. His smile, his eyes, they made my heart race. For the first time, I understood the true meaning of love. Late nights became filled with long messages, confessions, and dreams of a future together. I had no idea how this would all change me, but one thing was for sure, I had fallen headfirst into the world of love, something that had always seemed so distant and foreign. The first year of university flew by in a whirlwind of fun, parties, and emotions. I could feel myself changing. The shy, reserved girl who had left home just a year ago was no longer the same. I had tasted the thrill of independence, the freedom to make my own choices, and the complexities of relationships. As the year came to an end and everyone went home for the summer break, I found myself feeling empty. The dormitory, once full of laughter and energy, was now quiet and still. I missed the life I had created there, the late night talks, the laughter, the friends. And then everything changed again when I returned home. I walked into the house, and there he was, Michael, Sitting in his favorite chair, watching TV, his focus was completely on the screen, unaware that I had returned. A mischievous thought crossed my mind. I decided to sneak up behind him and surprise him, just like old times. Quietly, I crept closer, my hand raised to touch his shoulder. But just as I was about to scare him, he turned around, grabbed my hand, and pulled me into his arms. "You're back without telling me," he said, his voice warm with surprise. We both burst out laughing, the room filled with the joy of seeing each other again. I couldn't help but wonder how he had known I was coming. When I asked, he pointed to the mirror behind him. The mirror had reflected my every move, letting him know exactly what I was doing. I laughed at the discovery, feeling a mix of embarrassment and amusement. After catching up for a while, I told him I needed to get my suitcase and go back to my room. He smiled, nodding gently. The warmth in the house, the familiar scent of home, and the presence of my father made everything feel peaceful again. That evening, as we sat down for dinner, I shared stories about my year at university. We laughed, and he looked at me with such love and pride in his eyes. As I looked at him, something inside me stirred. My dad, Michael, was still so handsome despite being nearly 50. He maintained a youthful energy and strength. He was physically fit, his muscles still well defined. He had always worked hard, and his body reflected that. I noticed him in a way I never had before, and the more I looked, the more I felt this strange, confusing feeling inside. My thoughts began to spiral. I couldn't quite make sense of what I was feeling, but something about the way he looked at me, so full of love and admiration, was affecting me in ways I didn't understand. Then my father's voice broke my train of thought. "What are you thinking, Emily?" he asked, his voice gentle but filled with curiosity. I quickly snapped out of my thoughts, smiling and shaking my head. "Nothing, Dad, just thinking about school." The evening continued, but the strange feeling lingered. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the image of Michael's strong muscles from my mind. It was an innocent thought, but the more I tried to push it away, the more it stayed with me. The next day, the heat was unbearable. Sweat trickled down my back as I sat in the living room, trying to escape the suffocating heat. Michael had left for work early that morning, and I hadn't seen him since. I felt a strange restlessness in my body, a kind of anticipation I couldn't explain. The air in the house was thick and heavy, and I couldn't bear it any longer. I decided to take a break and step into the cool bathroom. The water was refreshing against my skin, and I closed my eyes, allowing the coolness to wash away the heat and frustration. As I stood there, lost in the sensation, I suddenly felt as if I wasn't alone. I opened my eyes, and there he was, Michael, standing at the door, his eyes fixed on me through the crack in the door. His gaze was intense, and his face showed a mixture of surprise and something I couldn't quite place. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. The silence between us stretched on, broken only by the sound of running water. Time seemed to slow down, and in that moment, I realized that everything had changed. I whispered, my voice trembling, "Dad, you're back." He blinked, looking confused, and his eyes darted around the room, almost searching for an excuse for his presence. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." His voice trailed off, and we stood there, the tension palpable in the air. The moment was fragile, teetering on the edge of something forbidden. The silence was finally broken when he turned and hurried away, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. As I stepped out of the bathroom, my thoughts were in turmoil. The strange feeling I had been trying to ignore had grown stronger. Michael and I were no longer just father and daughter. Something had shifted between us, and I couldn't deny it. The next few days were filled with confusion and desire as the lines between right and wrong began to blur. Every time I looked at Michael, I could feel the pull between us growing stronger. The passion, the tension, and the fear of being discovered all swirled around us. One day, I couldn't resist any longer. I found myself sitting next to him in the living room, the silence between us filled with unspoken words. My heart raced as I leaned in and whispered, "Did you see everything just now?" Michael stiffened, his eyes wide with shock, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he looked at me, his face a mixture of fear and longing. We both knew that we had crossed a line, but at that moment, neither of us could stop our emotions. Our desires were too strong to ignore. In the days that followed, our secret became the only thing that mattered. Every glance, every touch, every moment we shared was filled with passion, confusion, and a sense of inevitability. I couldn't resist the pull, and neither could he. The house, which had once been a peaceful retreat, now felt like a battleground of emotions. Every glance we exchanged, every conversation was loaded with unspoken words. I couldn't ignore the growing tension, and I knew Michael felt it too. It was impossible to pretend that things were the same as they once had been. Each day, I found myself torn between the love I had always felt for him as my father and the new, confusing emotions that had taken root in my heart. It wasn't just physical attraction. I had grown to admire Michael in ways I hadn't before. His strength, his resilience, the way he cared for me, even as an adult, it all made me see him through different eyes. But I couldn't let myself fall deeper into this dangerous territory. I tried to distance myself, to retreat to the boundaries of our relationship, but every time I looked at him, those feelings would resurface. Michael was no longer just the father I had always known. He had become something else, someone who, despite all logic, I couldn't stop thinking about. There were moments when I would look at him across the room and he would catch my gaze. The connection between us was undeniable. Tea wasn't just about physical desire. It was something deeper, something I didn't know how to explain. It was as though we both understood the unspoken tension between us, but neither of us could bring ourselves to address it directly. The emotional turmoil that consumed me began to affect every part of my life. I couldn't focus on my studies, and I couldn't concentrate when I was around others. My mind kept drifting back to Michael, to the overwhelming feelings I was trying so hard to suppress. I knew that if I didn't do something, this would consume me entirely. But it wasn't just me who was struggling with this. I could see the way Michael looked at me, his eyes filled with confusion, longing, and regret. He seemed torn just as I was. His usual strong demeanor had softened, replaced with moments of vulnerability. It was as if he too knew that something was wrong, but didn't know how to fix it. One evening, I decided that we needed to talk. The silence between us had grown too intense, and I couldn't pretend that everything was fine. I sat down across from him, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Dad, we need to talk about what's happening between us," I said, my voice trembling despite my attempts to stay composed. Michael looked up from his work, his face pale. "Grace, I don't know what's happening either. I've been trying to ignore it, but I can't. It's wrong, and I know it." My heart ached as I heard the pain in his voice. "I don't want this to destroy us, but I can't keep pretending that I don't feel what I feel, and I don't know how to stop it." For a long time, Michael didn't say anything. His eyes were filled with regret, confusion, and something else I couldn't identify. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and heavy. "I've raised you, Emily. I've watched you grow from a little girl into the woman you are now. I never wanted anything to come between us, but I understand. I know what you're feeling, and it's just as hard for me." I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes. I had never seen him this vulnerable before. "What do we do now?" I whispered, my heart breaking. "How do we move forward?" Michael looked at me with sadness in his eyes, his hands shaking. "We have to find a way to move past this, Emily. I don't know how, but we can't keep going down this road." We have to find our way back to where we were before all of this happened. I nodded, unsure of how to proceed, but one thing was clear. We both knew that we couldn't go back to the way things were. There was no undoing what had happened between us, no erasing the way we had crossed that line. I wasn't sure if we even wanted to. The days that followed were filled with an overwhelming sense of loss. The house felt different, as if the air itself had changed. We still lived together, still shared meals and moments of conversation, but the silence between us had grown even more intense. Neither of us knew how to fix what had been broken. I went back to university, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. How could I focus on my studies when the one person I had relied on for everything was now a stranger to me? I returned home for the summer break, but nothing was the same. Michael was distant, cold, even though his eyes still held that unspoken sadness. We spoke less, avoided each other more, and the weight of our shared silence became unbearable. The guilt weighed heavily on me. I couldn't help but wonder if I had ruined everything, our bond, our family, our future. At the end of the summer, I left for good. I found an apartment near campus and moved out, hoping that some distance would help both of us heal. But I knew that no matter where I went, the scars of what had happened would stay with me forever. Years passed and I tried to move on. I had relationships, built new friendships, and focused on my career. But in the quiet moments when I was alone, I would think about Michael, about us and the love that had, in some strange way, brought us together and torn us apart. I never saw him again after I moved out. We kept in touch through occasional emails, but they were brief and distant. There were times when I wanted to go back, to apologize, to try to make things right, but I knew it would never be the same. And now, as I sit here reflecting on everything, I wonder if there's any way to truly heal from what happened. Maybe I'll never fully understand why it all unfolded the way it did. But what I do know is that the journey I've been on, the strange and painful journey of love, loss, and regret has shaped me in ways I never expected. My advice to anyone who finds themselves at a crossroads in life, torn between desire and what's right, is simple. Think carefully before you act. Emotions can be powerful, but they can also be dangerous. Don't let them cloud your judgment. Cherish what you have and never forget the people who love you. The choices you make today will follow you for the rest of your life. In the end, we all have to live with the consequences of our actions, and the weight of those consequences can last a lifetime.